Let's go ahead. I'll just get right into it. So this concept of scholarship of teaching and learning, abbreviated as SoTL. Sometimes people pronounce it as SoTL, but I like SoTL better, and I think that's more the preferred terminology. So what I'm going to do today is give you a little introduction to that, show you some examples of that, and some of the ways that we have actually ventured into this. When I say we, it's typically me collaborating with others. I've done some of my own SoTL research, and so I'm also going to give you a template. So one of the sheets that you may have picked up on the way in, if you didn't get that, you can go ahead and get that. The single-page sheet is just the real brief summary of the template. And then the other sheet we'll reference to as we get through some of the slides. But it's very straightforward, hopefully, and feel free to interrupt me as we go along. So let's start by defining what it is. What is this notion of scholarship of teaching and learning? It came out of, I guess, Ernest Boyer, I think is the name, who in like 1990 or something published something like that teaching and learning is scholarship, and he kind of started this notion that what we do in our classes, how the innovative things that we're doing are actually or can be made into research projects, and we should think about them as research just like we would in other contexts. And so that's what this is. It's basically some combination of what you're doing in the classroom and some research mentality, bringing some research idea to that teaching and learning context. And one of the assumptions, starting back to Boyer that I mentioned earlier, was that is as much scholarship as what you would do in the lab or in the field or other kinds of creative activity. So there's been a lot of interest in pushing for getting us to do research, interest in terms of journals and conferences and organizations that are really interested in pushing this SoTL idea. And we have a very good history at MTSU of producing that. So we actually have an archive of, it's a little outdated, it's about 3 years old, and I'm about to send out a new announcement to faculty that have published in SoTL stuff. But going back 2014 and earlier, we had something like 30 or 40 citations of MTSU faculty who have done things that are SoTL related, and that's really good. I think we do it very well here at MTSU, and that's just reflecting maybe our mission and some of the interests of faculty. Plus, we push that out of the center as well. That's something that I'll stress. If you ever talk to me, you might hear me say, that's a good research idea. Have you thought of doing a SoTL project with that? Okay, and one of the things that I found and other people have found is that you may find that publishing in a SoTL journal is a little bit easier than your disciplinary. I think that's definitely true in my field in psychology, just because there's just so much more hurdles, and the reviewers are much more hypercritical in my disciplinary research than they are in SoTL. And part of that reflects that people are really interested in, like, what are you doing, and can I do it in my class? And so that actually trickles down into the review experience that you're likely to have when you submit something for a SoTL. Okay? So in 2013, a couple of researchers, Wilson, Denges, and Garang, published what they called gold standard of SoTL research practices. This was specific to psychology, but it's general enough that really applies to. If you're thinking about doing a SoTL project, then you want to keep in mind some of these principles. And you'll see the examples that I'm using. I did some of those things, but not necessarily all of those. So among those practices are, when you can, bring in theory. Okay? So you're testing some hypotheses that are tied to theory. The better you can do that, increases your chances you're going to get it published, because people are interested in that, for one thing. If you can use longitudinal designs, the better. So you want to track change in your students over time. And or experimental designs. So experimental designs are where I might give one class a particular, what I think is innovative or interesting, and not have the other class do that, holding everything else constant. if you can, okay? That'd be great if you can do that. It's messy when you have real classes, right? And you don't have the luxury of like randomly assigning students within classes and things like that. But it's not impossible. They also talk about whenever possible, this is where you might get hung up in by reviewers when you're trying to publish a SoTL paper, is like, what was your control group? I didn't have one. Everybody in my class got this, and they all seemed to like it. And it's like, compared to what? Was it you they liked? Was it what you did? We can't really tell, okay? So you want to have, if you can, a control condition. One of the ways to do that if you're teaching classes is one of my classes, like I said, I don't do that thing. I do everything else the same, but the other class gets it, and then I can compare. That's the kind of thing that reviewers would look for. And we call that, in research terms, that's the control condition. And then, whenever you can, randomly assign. So if you can't randomly assign within a class because the whole class is getting something, then think about randomly assigning a class. So if I'm teaching 2 sections of a course, that's like an ideal opportunity for me to do one thing with one class and one with another. And which class should I do my special thing with? I'll just flip a coin. So that is literally something that I've chosen randomly. Okay, and there are other standards that they talk about, but these are kind of like the basic things that in order for something to qualify, typically from a reviewer's perspective, as a scholarship of teaching and learning type project, it would need to have some of these kind of elements. Okay, so this may be pushing you into areas that you have not gone into before, especially with regard to ethical training and IRB approval, for example. So when you do a SoTL project, you typically need to do that at the start, get the IRB approval. So if you've not gone through that process, there are some training requirements and some other hoops that you have to jump through, including the application form to conduct the study. But typically, that's another thing about SoTL projects. They're easy to get reviewed because you're not doing anything like really stressful or demanding or threatening or have lots of risks to your students. And so they're typically much easier to get approved than some of the things that we might do in psychology, for example, where we might stress out our students or deceive them or something like that.
Do you have to get IRB approval for every project?
No, you don't have to get IRB approval at all unless you're wanting to publish. So really, that's what I'm saying is, if you think you want to publish something, you're going to, or you could even, then that's where you want to go ahead and get the IRB approval up front, even if you're not really sure you want to do that. Because technically, they would tell you, no, you can only use the data that you've collected once you've gotten approval. You can't like retroactively go back and use the data from your, but that's a grayish area. But my solution to resolving that grayish area is like, if I think potentially I could get something publishable out of this, then as soon as I start collecting data from my students, end of semester course evals or something that I'm going to use, I'll make sure it's like an official research project.
What about theoretical research based on hypotheticals?
Do you need IRB for that?
Yeah.
No, you would not. As long as it's not involving human subjects, which it wouldn't, no. So I'm really talking about if you're collecting data, you're observing, you're using objective like test score data from your classes, that kind of thing. That's where they would. But in other contexts, no, you wouldn't have to. Okay? So let's see. Oh, and one other thing, another best practice is, as much as possible, I tell my students, let other people do the work for you up to a point. We're not talking about plagiarism here. We're talking about other people have created measures and validated them for you, so you don't have to create new measures. So when I consult with folks on a SoTL project and they're wanting to measure something like self-efficacy or perceptions of learning or something like that, one of our first steps is to let's go in the literature and see if somebody's already created a measure of that, because most likely they have. And then that's what you want to use. You don't want to create your own because it has no psychometric properties. You haven't demonstrated that. And that will prevent you from getting things published, potentially. So go and use the things that other people have already created as much as you can. Sometimes you can't. You have to focus on your own. Now, this doesn't apply to content tests. So, for example, if in your course you're giving them knowledge test that's based on the content, that isn't the same thing as a standardized or validated measure. What that refers to, that's just an objective test, and you can create that yourself, and it doesn't matter. That's going to be like how well they actually did and they performed in the course. What I'm talking about here are things like personality variables or perception variables or attitudes towards the teacher or the course or things like that. Okay? So, here's a couple of useful resources. I'm going to jump out here in a second to a couple of journals and just show you what their current issue table of contents are. Give you an idea of the wide range. There's, like I said, lots of conferences and lots of publications, and you can pretty much do, from what I can tell, any kind of SoTL project. And it's research or creative activity. So this is sometimes case studies of individual classes. So in my class, I did this, and this is what happened. Even if I didn't formally collect data, I could describe it anecdotally, or I can get the responses of students qualitatively in terms of what happened. Some journals will publish that kind of thing. I think that's becoming more difficult to publish because more and more journals are looking for data. Reflective essay summaries, integrations of scholarship on teaching, that's what you were referring to, Zaf. And that's fairly common too, that people will pull together, integrate. This is how people might try to do this, something that could then generate future research, for example. One of the examples I'll talk about, we kind of took that strategy, in fact. And if you get more into the gold standard stuff, then you're talking about trying to compare how students' grades changed or their attitudes or their behavior in some cases changed over time. Especially if you have a pre-test, post-test kind of design. That's better because then you can make more convincing causal statements. That is what you did in your course that actually led to them showing more positive attitudes or behaviors. Okay? And then, of course, there are more formal experimental designs where you could manipulate things. And I'll give you a couple of examples. One group that I've worked with on some of these kind of projects, one of the members of our team had 4 sections of the same course that she was teaching. And so in 2 of them, she did one kind of thing, and the 2 others, she tried another variant of that. And so we actually, that borders on a true experimental design, where everybody else is treated the same. It's the same instructor, it's the same content, but they're getting different things, all, in this case, in an online context. So we also held that constant. So you could do things like that. So the point I'm making, and I hope that will strike you, is think outside the box. When I first started doing this kind of research, it was like a light bulb experience for me. It's like, I'd been trying some interesting things. I'm going to try this in my class. Students seem to like it. Wow, cool, the end. And I realized that there's this whole discipline of, somebody must have told me, or I read about it or heard about it, why don't you try to collect data on this and try to publish this, because other people would like to learn about this. And that was the light bulb. I realized that, oh, you mean it's like research? Wow, I didn't really think of that. So even though I was trained in research, I wasn't thinking of my teaching as necessarily a research kind of worthy or context for that. So that's another kind of way to kind of think differently. Are there things you're doing that could be researchable in your courses? Okay. Mm-hmm.
Okay. So the reason I'm here is the use of this device in the classroom, and I've been using it for approaching 2 years now. Uh-huh. And so I just used it as a teaching tool to begin with.
Okay.
No thought of research.
Yes.
Until I realized how useful it was. So to do things like compare grades before or after, I use it in every class. I'm not going to stop using it. And I teach one of these courses per semester, so I cannot have an experimental and a control. And I'm not going to not use it for any class in the future because it's so beneficial. So unless I could go back and historically pull data, which would be difficult for IRB because it's in the past.
You could potentially do that because it'd be archival but it would be more problematic research-wise because there are lots of other things that have changed besides just time, right, including your teaching and things like that. You might have some trouble with that, but you want to think about, in that case, think about, now when you use this, you actually record your lectures and then you load them up right after and they have those available, right?
I have them requesting.
And that's what you're not going to give up in any of your classes because that's effective. So if you can't or you won't, you can, but you don't want to, right? If that's the case, then you want to focus on, if you can, within the course, still try to do a pre-post in terms of attitudes and or knowledge and show that, especially attitudes about what this is producing for you and for the class. That's what I would do. And then also, if you could show like knowledge change. That's something that a lot of journals would be interested in seeing. So they look for attitude data, but they also look for behavioral or outcome data, like we would call student success type data. So you could do that even with everybody. It's kind of like a one group pre-test, post-test, if that's what you were doing. And there are limits to that because there's alternative interpretations and all that. But that's really not, in my discipline, that would be a problematic design. But in the SoTL, it's less problematic because people would really like to know about what students think and how you're using that tool.
Student engagement data would be one of the things I want to look at. So it would be their perception of that.
Yes. That's how I would think of it, especially if there's no way I'm going to give this up because I'm just convinced that it works. And
well, they could compare it to other courses they're in, I suppose.
You could. Mm-hmm. And you could go outside of, does anybody else teach that course? Okay. If you did have somebody who taught that course but didn't use this technology, you could compare. But then the problem with that is there's differences between you and me if I'm the other person teaching it in terms of our style and things like that.
What's the course?
Aerodynamics, aircraft performance, 2 different courses that I could do it in.
Okay. Good. That actually ties in well. If we don't run out of time before you have to leave, Nate, ties in well with some of the examples that I wanted to show you, or some of the ways that you would use the template. So here are the 2 journals. I'm going to jump out. I think this will work. To each of these and just look at their current table of contents and show you the range of things that they're publishing. So let's see. Where's their current issue? It's right here. Okay, so I don't know if you can see this. I'll make it a little bit larger. These are a list of some of the topics that they published in this first journal. Triple flip using technology for writing, students' perspectives on the first day of class. I mean, if you go and look into these kind of journals, you're going to want to do that anyway, because part of the template is, has somebody already done this? Have somebody already talked about the swivel in the literature and beat you to the punch, Nate? You need to know that, otherwise your work is just a waste of time if you're going to try to publish it and somebody's already beaten you to that. That's crucial to know. But also, like all these different ideas, and there are things that you might think about. Sometimes you might even see some ideas in here that, I'm doing something sort of like that. I wonder what they did. I'll do something different, and that'll be a nice project. It's like there's lots of opportunities.
Is this journal mainly for university students?
It is. The 2 I'm pulling up I'm pretty sure, are higher education. It doesn't say that, International Journal, Scholarship of Teaching and Learning, but most of the Scholarship of Teaching and Learning is actually being conducted in higher education context. Some people do study K through 12 and they'll publish in these, but the vast majority are going to be higher ed college kind of contexts. So let's go back.
They are peer-reviewed comments.
They are, which is important. And so that raises an issue is, does your department and your college look at SoTL products as equally research publications to like your disciplinary? Depends on the department, depends on the college. At MTSU, I think that's not an issue. Most of the SoTL stuff that I do and that I've worked with others with, however, having said that, is that the SoTL projects are like icing on the cake. There are other things beyond your disciplinary. And that's how I look at it. That's how I look at it for me and other people, that I've worked with some junior faculty who we were able to get some publications that were SoTL. They just had those as like extras, and it helped. And that's a way to think about SoTL. Unless your department is like really highly tied into that, like some of the departments in the College of Ed, ZAF, might very much be interested in these and put those as a high priority. Right?
It ties in beautifully to a course I teach, which is, I'm going to call my course no longer action research, I'm going to call it SoTL.
Ah.
So SoTL and action research, which is K-12 action research in classroom, is very similar.
Yes, it is.
To what you're presenting.
Yeah, the action research is you're doing the research despite the traditional limitations of pure research because it's still interesting and important and people want to know about it. It's very, very closely tied to SoTL.
And a question about the journal. Are they themed per month, per semester, or is it free for all?
Mostly, from what I've seen and when we've published, it's just whatever they get. So there are occasional thematic issues, and you'll see calls for those and that kind of thing, but you have to be a little more in the loop, or you have to check the journal for that.
And processing time. Sorry for that. I'm excited. I didn't know this existed. So if SoTL was very subtle. So what's the timeline if I submit something?
Just like I think it's easier to get published in SoTL journals than disciplinary, it's also faster. And those are probably correlated because they are wanting to generate, there's a lot of interest in this. There's going to be people that want to see what people are doing in the classroom. I think it's feeding into interest in student success initiatives, and also it's a very large and expanding field, which is a great advantage for us if you want to actually publish in that.
Do you actually have a hard copy of the journal?
Are there hard copies of journals anymore? I don't think there are. I think that both of these are, and most of them are. I don't think we have any on the shelves that are hard copy because the libraries stopped purchasing hard copies anymore. Yeah. So this is good because it makes searching much easier. So let me click on the second one for you. This is just the standard Journal of Scholarship of Teaching and Learning. I think this comes out of Indiana University, yeah. And then the table of contents of their current edition shows articles like these. You see that it's similar to the other, if you can read that. Doesn't matter if students have the same instructor for both lecture and lab sections. Team teaching an interdisciplinary first-year seminar. This sounds like a case study kind of thing, right? They did a particular case study. Student engagement and compulsory intro physiology course. That's the thing. When you look at the tables of contents, there's people are just doing all kinds of really interesting stuff in their courses. Are you? That's what you need to think. And what is it that you're doing? Okay?
Free for anybody to read the articles, read the login accounts with?
No, these are all, at least the current issues. I don't know as they, extend out. But the ethos, I guess, of SoTL is we want to get the word out. And so there's typically not any kind of, you have to pay for the articles or that. These two, I think, are open access. And that's pretty common in the field, too.
With that, are there publication fees if they're open access?
On occasion, I think maybe I've published 25 or so, including chapters as well as studies. And we maybe had to pay 2 or 3 times out of those. Most of them are not. There's not publication charges for those. Okay? So, this is the working template. This is what I really wanted to get at. Because I think it works well, and it's a handy way to think about your own possible projects. So I'm going to go through that quickly, and then I'm going to give you a couple of examples of what we've done. So the first thing that you should do, in my opinion, to do a true SoTL study is and this is what I ask people when they talk to me about it, it's what is it you're doing in your class that is interesting, innovative, unique, that you think is really making a difference? In your case, Nate, you're using the swivel to record what goes on in the class so that students can reference it later and go back and help to restudy or to clarify questions, Okay. Is that innovative? Is that unique? You need to determine that, right, before you go to do research on that. So find what you're doing and see if there's a niche for that. That's how I think about it. Is there a niche? Because you have to make that niche determination. And sometimes we've done, not very often, maybe once or twice, we've looked and said, oh, somebody's already done that. I guess we shouldn't do that. That's very rare because the way they did it isn't the same way that we're doing it. And so we have the option to try to do something a little bit different. Second step is then what I've been alluding to here is go into the literature and see if anybody else has done that. Okay, so what is it that you're doing? Every time I learn about really cool things that our faculty are doing, that's my bias again. Is like, have you thought about doing a SoTL project with that? No, I never thought about that. Well, the next thing you need to do is to go in and look in the literature and see if anybody's. If they haven't, there's your niche. Okay, and you want to not find people that have done stuff that you're thinking about doing, because then that gives you the opportunity to do your project. So how do you do that? The two journals I just pulled up, most electronic online website journal listings have a search this journal box, and that's what I do. I go into that journal. I go into these two journals and I search for whatever it is I'm using. So in this particular case, the technology, I'd go in and type in swivel. See if anybody's published anything in swivel. We could do that right here now. That'd be the first step. And that is the niche determination question that's crucial. Because that's the yes-no. And, people have been publishing a whole bunch of stuff on this. That's probably not a way to go. Okay? So here's the template continued. There's basically like 4 parts to it. And I think that's what our little poster thing is that we had over there on the wall. Is it's got these kind of the 4 steps of the template right there. And it's also what I've given you on that individual sheet. So the third step of the template is the nitty-gritty of actually doing the research. And this is like, okay, what's your design? What are the data you're going to collect? Objective, perceptual data. Are you going to have faculty provide data? Sometimes what we do are we create new techniques, and then we have other faculty that are actually administering them, and we could ask them how they thought it worked and that kind of thing. So you have a lot of options. One of the things that I do as a default in all my courses, even if I'm not doing anything that I'm going to turn into a SoTL project, is to have a course evaluation of my own. I've not found the universities useful at all because it doesn't have anything to do with, not really at all, but it doesn't have anything to do with my course. So I always ask about, did you like this? So the other handout that you'll see there is an example of the kind of questionnaire that I create in D2L for like all my courses.
On the questionnaire, if you're going to publish that, do you have to have IRB?
That is where I would go into and have my IRB. So It's not in the example I gave you, but when I do research on that, the first page of the first thing they see in the survey at the end of the semester in my courses is, I'm going to be using this for research purposes. If you would like to participate, please continue, which is what IRB requires that we do. Everything's anonymous, so there's no issues about identifiability and things like that. But
can you do that on an on-ground class? Not have them do it online, but have somebody else?
Mm-hmm. You can do that for sure. Yep. So this is the point where you want to get your IRB approval if you're going to. That is like what you're supposed to do. As far as I know, the IRB has never gone and checked our publications and seen if whatever we published on, we had IRB approval. But I wouldn't put it past them. The problem is they're understaffed, and that's not a high priority thing for them. And why would they do that anyway? But we're supposed to be doing that. So I just, as a default, do I think I'm going to use my data for anything for publishing purposes? Then IRB. No, doesn't become an issue then. Okay, then at that point, after you've done your experimental design and collected your data, then you find the appropriate venue. And here you have lots of options because the 2 examples I pulled up, those journals those are generalist journals. But in your discipline, very likely, I know in education there are education-related SoTL. And there are now English and history and business, and psychology has one. Most disciplines are now creating a Scholarship of Teaching and Learning journal. That's great. That's awesome, because that's where you want to target. And that's probably going to have a little more credibility if you're, getting rehired or going up for promotion and tenure or whatever, if it's in your disciplinary SoTL journal. But you have those options. And then, of course, you just go through all the hoops of getting it hopefully accepted, and after you've made 3 or 4 revisions or 1 or 2 revisions or whatever the case might be, then you go to the boulevard and celebrate. And or you add it to your research and creative activity record. Okay? So that's the template. So what I want to show you now are a couple examples of what we've done and how we did that. And that'll be the last part of the presentation. Any questions at this point? Any other questions?
For longitudinal, that part of it, is there a suggested length, or does it depend on the time of the project?
It would depend on the project, but typically we're constrained by a single semester because that's when we have the students. So that's likely to be the boundary condition. It doesn't have to be, because you could follow students to see if they've retained that information or they still have positive attitudes a year later. There's a lot of difficulty in doing that kind of research, but it's possible. More the question in longitudinal is, do you do it beginning of the semester and the end of the semester, or do you do a narrower, so it could be halfway through or something like that? And that's what I consider. Most pre-post start at the beginning of the semester because the students are naive. They haven't really been exposed to me as the instructor or the content. So objectively, they're going to do really badly on the objective test if I have that, right? So you would use that to your advantage potentially. At the end of the semester, they should have learned a whole lot. And if they got the intervention and the other class didn't, there should be a difference in the ones where we use the swivel. That's the kind of thing that you would think about. And that is essentially a longitudinal. It's a pre-test, post-test kind of.
Okay, yeah, the SoTL projects I've seen before have been in writing, and I've seen like 3 or 4, and they're like multiple years.
Yeah.
Like
yeah.
From freshman year to senior.
Yeah, that's great. If you can do it, and we can do that, but you just have to be able to track. We would have to track them by like M number or something like that, and it's doable. If you're teaching gen ed classes and you want to see if there's reason to think theoretically that this intervention or this innovative practice has long-term benefits, that's a really interesting thing. And of course, if you can do that, there's going to be a lot of people interested in publishing that, if you can demonstrate its efficacy.
So you published 25.
I haven't added lately. Something like that. Yeah. And a lot of that is, several have come out of consulting here, so that's a nice little perk of this position. But it's also the mentality I have is like, have you thought about doing a SoTL on that? No, what do I need to do? I don't know how to do a research design. I don't know how to measure things. We do. I do. We can help you with that. And so we've pushed that out of the center. But the examples I'm going to show you aren't in that context. They were of my own doing or the research team. So here's one example. In our psych department, we have a careers course for our majors. It's a required course, taught it many years, but I realized as I was teaching it that I think this would work really well online, because we always have trouble bringing in guest speakers, which is what we wanted to do, to talk about different subfield activities, and we brought in people from the Career Center and all this kind of stuff. Like, that was a nightmare, semester after semester after semester, scheduling them, giving up class time for it and all. So there were good reasons why the online version should work really well for a career seminar. Okay, so what I did was I had been teaching that in a face-to-face context, but I converted it to online. And the way that I did that was where I'd normally lecture out in the class and bring in guest researchers, I just basically flipped that. So I recorded my own presentations that I would typically do and narrated them, and also had them transcribed so that they were accessible. Now that you may know we have to do that now, but this was earlier in the last decade or so. I did that too. I built in some self-test activities that you can do like in D2L. These little self-tests. There's something called Respondus, if you've ever used that or heard of that. Makes it real easy to create these little. So I basically just created what we thought in the department was a pretty good course, good online course. It included video interviews that I conducted with faculty members and with students who had done research experience, because we're trying to tell our students about how to do research. And so here was the course. It was like a case study in some ways. It's this course converted to an online. And what I gave you in the second handout is like the assessment that I gave in D2L at the end of the course. So you'll see I asked them about all kinds of things, about the interviews, the self-tests, the narrated presentations. I will always do that. Whatever I'm doing in my class, the survey I create in D2L, end of semester, has everything of significance in my course that I ask students about. So I always have those data. And I would encourage you to do that yourself if you can. Then in this course, because in my discipline in psych, in the SoTL journals, the Teaching of Psychology journal, our main teaching journal, they pretty much require that you have objective data. They'll reject your papers if all it is student self-reports or perceptual subjective data. So I made sure that I had that knowing going in. And so what I did was I asked at the beginning of the semester my students, what is all this, answer this quiz basically, which is all the stuff they should have learned by the time they finished the course. And then I did that at the end of the semester and I compared those. And of course, we weren't sure, but of course, there was a large difference in their performance, a significant difference in their performance pre and post. And in Teaching of Psychology, they were happy with that. I showed that they actually showed a significant increase in their knowledge from the beginning of the course to the end of the course. Okay, so I give this example as the story I told to get this published was teaching this, first of all, careers courses are very popular now. Lots of departments are doing that. Lots of, actually not just psych, but it's very common in many other disciplines now that we have these careers courses. I made that point, but then I made the point of teaching it online has several advantages and da-da-da. So I went about all the conveniences of doing that. And that was what I would call the story that I tried to convince them to publish this by. That's the kind of thing that you would maybe want to do in more of a case study version. Now, this was published like more than 10 years ago. It's probably 13 or 14 years ago. If I tried to publish it today like this, probably wouldn't be able to, because fewer and fewer places are publishing this more case study approach. And more people, of course, have now created online courses and stuff. So you have to be kind of a little bit ahead of the curve if you can be, if you know what the curve is.
So what did you find out in your pre-test post?
Well, that was mainly to determine do they now know what they're supposed to know as majors in psychology compared to what they knew at the beginning of the course. Yes, they got more correct answers. It was a multiple choice, basically. So it was like an objective test. And, of course, their attitudes were they really liked this. They loved the video interviews. That's the most popular part of the whole course. That was really because they were really, it's like you're there listening, talking to the faculty member or the students and stuff. So, of course, we highlighted that. I highlighted that in the story. The other example is from a research team here that a group of us have been meeting on other SoTL projects that came out of a faculty learning community. And we just said, hey, D2L has this new tool called Conditional Release. It means that you can, hold content, prevent students from getting certain content until they've reached some kind of criterion. So they've taken a quiz and scored at least a 70% or something like that. Then the material is released. It's sometimes called intelligent agent. It's the same kind of idea. A lot of the learning management systems now are using this kind of approach to help to individualize student learning. So we thought, how are we supposed to do that? Well, should we set the barrier at 90%, or should it be 40% in order to open up the... So we were looking for best practice information on using this new tool that these learning management systems were developing, and we found none. Okay? So what we did is we should determine our own best practices then. So this is the team, Luana Fisher, who's in university studies, Justin Gardner in agribusiness, and Dina Raffo in management and marketing, or what is now called management, I think. They split apart. And what we did then first was, this is what we think would be the best practice ways of using this CR tool, this conditional release tool. Okay? So we published a paper on that, best practices. We found a place that was willing to, and we made the case that these companies are creating these tools, but they're not telling us how we're supposed to use it. They're just telling us how you set it up and get it to work. But how do we actually use it to maximum benefit with our students? That was our mentality. So we described those best practices. Then we did a survey study. Several of us, all of us, except for me, I didn't really use it in my courses, but the rest of our team did. And we asked our students what they thought about the different things that we were doing. We were employing those best practices that we had generated, pretty much. And so what we found was students liked this, they didn't like that, but pretty much they were supporting our best practice recommendations. Paper number 2 then documented the support for these best practices. We found a different journal that published that. Okay, so in this case, we're building an actual sort of research literature. Very early stages of doing that. We didn't stop there. Then we thought, what we haven't demonstrated is we haven't done a true experiment with this. So we did a true experiment. And the example I said before about somebody had 4 classes, all online. They're actually two different classes, I think. She was teaching 4 online classes, but they were 2 different courses. And so for each of the 2 courses, one got conditional release and the other didn't. And that was basically randomly determined. Then we looked at performance of the students, their attitudes, what they thought of the course, what they thought of the instructor, and all that in a formal research design. And we published that as a 3rd paper. So that was based on this controlled research design. So this, in all 3 cases, in Luana's case, that's really pretty close to her disciplinary. She's in university studies. And so this counts for her very much so. It counted for her. Whereas in Justin, Dina, in my case, it's more of the icing on the cake kind of things, not specific to our discipline. But very interesting, we thought, and we were able to be productive to do that. By the way, this team, we have, I think it's 6 or 7 publications. Most of them are SoTL, but we've been working together for about 10 years now. So another recommendation I could make is, if you're going to go into this SoTL, see if you can find some collaborators, because you can be more productive that way as well. I'm always pushing collaboration. If you ever talk to me, you'll hear me say that. So here's the point where I said that.
How is, if you have so many names up there versus your name, how is that looked at?
So Justin and Dina were junior faculty at the time they started. And we arranged for order of authorship that would be maximally beneficial to them as icing on the cake, knowing that it wasn't really their disciplinary. But it worked out for us. We're a good team. We work together. We just I don't really need it myself, so I'm happy to be the last author on things. But the way it turned out is we typically, in fairness, cycle through. Okay, you're going to take the lead. Okay, you'll be the first author. And if you look at our record of publications, we're pretty much we've randomly, not randomly because it was strategic. We would do that.
Are there places for grants for these things? So outside of the university?
Yes, there are. But the funds are limited as far as I can tell. There's some things within the university, but outside, the Department of Education, the federal government, but those are big time, multi-year, often multi-institutional, where you have a set kind of thing. But that is an option.
Because the grants I usually see seem to be in secondary ed, much more than they are in higher ed. So higher ed people doing secondary ed, researching secondary ed.
And the emphasis of that research isn't necessarily SoTL either. It's often some theoretical model or some technology. I think there's interest in technology. And I don't think we've ever tried for any SoTL-related grant funding. Not anything, not on the order of these kinds of projects that we're talking about. But you never know. But it doesn't seem to be that high a priority. I don't think it's a very high priority in the government, except for maybe the Department of Education might have a few things like that. Okay, so this is the last slide. What about you? We actually had talked a little bit. When in Nate's example, we talked about what he was thinking about. But do you have a project you're considering? What is that, if you're interested in or willing to share? And if you do, what are the areas where you would need some help in getting that kicked off the ground? Because we provide you, we being, I say the LT&ITC, but that's basically me. That's part of my job here, is the assessment, research design, statistical analysis, and writing. Actually writing for publication. I can help with any of those things. And that's one of the ways that I've actually been able to be more productive, is that I can help on different phases of the project. So the point about that is, it doesn't have to be the center, but if you could find a collaborator who could help with some of these other issues, then that just balances out really well. And that's what I try to do with the teams that I work with. We look for individual strengths and what people can bring to that, and then we work on, over time, multiple projects. The next time I hit this, it's going to go dark. It's going to be, and the little white stuff that says up there, do you know what it says? How many times have you seen that? Do you know what it actually says? This is the end of the presentation? Literally, what's it say? End of slideshow. End of slideshow. Click to exit. It's like, this is the end of the slideshow. So if you have an interest in importing the survey that I have, I can easily do that. Basically, I can either give you permission into one of my developmental shells, or vice versa. You can give me a permission in your course, and I can copy it so you don't have to create it anew. We have other examples of that too if you want to. That's what I typically do. I'll give my survey to somebody else, and then they go in and individualize it for their course. And at the very least, I would encourage you to do that, because then you might be able to start to see some trends that might trigger some ideas for some research projects.
Would the beginning of the term differ a little bit? Is it like a pre-post thing? Or
giving them that?
Yeah. Like
should you give them? And good question. People do that. And in fact, that's a good approach if you're studying like changes in attitude. So some people in the math and science ed PhD program, some of their projects have to do with, we want to see if the efficacy of students in like teaching science, for example, whether their science teaching efficacy goes up from the beginning of the course to the end. And so they will then give that out. Typically, that's not online. That's in the class. And in order to do that, you would just have to track them. And so I would use like M number or something like that, so that when we give it to them a second time, we can match them up. And there's all kinds of little details about that. Yeah. Okay? Okay. Oh, thanks. Thanks. And feel free to consult, because that's what we do here in the center.